A young woman's desperate circumstances force her into servitude, but destiny has other plans in the fields of Millbrook Valley. The autumn wind carried whispers of change across the rolling hills of Millbrook Valley, where golden wheat swayed like ocean waves beneath a pewter sky. It was in this remote corner of the countryside that Cordelia's fate would be sealed, though she could never have imagined it as the rickety wagon bounced along the rutted dirt road toward her uncertain future. Her fingers clutched the worn leather handle of her small traveling case, the only possession she had left in the world. Inside lay her mother's silver locket, a few tattered letters, and the simple cotton dress she had worn to her father's funeral just 3 weeks prior. The rest of her life had been stripped away by debts and cruel circumstance, leaving her with no choice but to accept the arrangement that would bind her to Whitmore Estate. "You'll work hard, girl," the wagon driver had warned as they approached the property gates. "Mr. Whitmore don't tolerate laziness, but he's fair to those who earn their keep." His weathered face had softened slightly. "Better than the workhouse, I reckon." Cordelia had nodded silently, her throat too tight with unshed tears to speak. The workhouse. The very word sent shivers down her spine. When her father's gambling debts had surfaced after his death, the creditors had been merciless. Her childhood home, her belongings, even her mother's china, everything had been sold to settle what they could. The remaining debt would have sent her to the workhouse, a fate worse than death for a young woman of gentle breeding. That was when Mrs. Henderson, the village magistrate's wife, had mentioned the opportunity at Whitmore Estate. Silas Whitmore, the wealthy landowner, needed additional help for the harvest season and was willing to take on workers who could earn their way through service. It wasn't charity, Mrs. Henderson had emphasized, but honest work for honest pay. After a year of service, Cordelia would be free to go with enough money to start fresh somewhere new. As the wagon crested the final hill, Whitmore Estate spread before them like something from a storybook. The main house stood 3 stories tall, its red brick walls glowing warm in the afternoon light. White shutters framed each window, and climbing roses cascaded over a wraparound porch that seemed to welcome visitors with open arms. To the left stretched vast fields where workers moved like tiny figures against the golden grain, while to the right stood a collection of outbuildings, barns, stables, and what appeared to be quarters for the estate workers. "Impressive sight, ain't it?" the wagon driver observed. "Whitmore families owned this land for near 50 years, built it up from nothing but scrub brush and stones." The wagon drew to a halt before the main house, and Cordelia climbed down on unsteady legs. Her simple grey dress and worn boots felt shabby against the backdrop of such prosperity, but she straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. Her mother had always said that dignity came from within, not from fine clothes or social position. Heavy footsteps echoed across the porch boards, and Cordelia looked up to see a man emerging from the house. Silas Whitmore was not what she had expected. Rather than the elderly, perhaps cruel taskmaster she had imagined, he appeared to be in his early 40s, with thick brown hair touched by silver at the temples and kind eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His clothes were well made but practical: dark trousers, a white shirt open at the collar, and a brown vest that had seen honest work. "Miss Cordelia?" His voice was deep and measured, with the slight accent common to those who had lived their entire lives in these rolling hills. "I'm Silas Whitmore. Mrs. Henderson wrote to say you'd be arriving today." Cordelia dropped a small curtsy, the gesture automatic after years of proper upbringing. "Yes, sir. Thank you for taking me on. I promise to work hard and earn my keep." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. Most of the workers who came to the estate were rough folk from the villages, accustomed to hard labor and coarse manners. Cordelia's refined speech and graceful movements marked her as something different, though she clearly tried to hide her genteel background. "No need for formality," Silas said gently. "You'll be staying in the workers' quarters with the other women. Mrs. Hartwell will show you to your room and explain your duties." He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. "Have you worked a farm before, Miss Cordelia?" "No, sir," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm willing to learn whatever you need me to do." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I'm sure you are. Mrs. Hartwell will start you with lighter duties while you find your footing. The harvest season is demanding, but we take care of our people here." But at that moment, a sturdy woman in her 50s appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. Her grey hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her brown eyes held both warmth and shrewdness. "You must be Cordelia," she said with a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "I'm Mrs. Hartwell, the head housekeeper. Come along, dear, and I'll get you settled. You look ready to drop from exhaustion." As they walked toward the workers' quarters, Mrs. Hartwell chatted easily about life on the estate. "We've got 12 full-time workers plus seasonal help during harvest," she explained. "Everyone pulls their weight, but we're like family here. Mr. Whitmore sees to that. He's a good man, fair and decent. Lost his wife some years back, poor soul, but he's never let it make him bitter." The workers' quarters were surprisingly comfortable, a long, low building with individual rooms for the women and shared common areas. Cordelia's room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small window that looked out over the fields. After the uncertainty of the past weeks, it felt like luxury. "Supper's at 6, Mrs. Hartwell said, setting down a fresh pitcher of water. "You'll eat with the other workers in the kitchen. Tomorrow you'll start with me in the house, cleaning, mending, helping with meals. Once you're stronger, you might move to outdoor work if you choose." That evening, Cordelia sat at the long wooden table in the estate's kitchen, surrounded by workers whose hands were calloused and whose faces were weathered by sun and wind. They were kind enough, these simple folk, but she felt the gulf between her upbringing and theirs with every word spoken. Still, they welcomed her without question, sharing stories of their work and their families as they passed around plates of hearty stew and fresh bread. Through the kitchen window, she could see the main house glowing with lamplight. Somewhere in those elegant rooms, Silas Whitmore was probably finishing his own dinner, perhaps reading by the fire or reviewing the accounts for his prosperous estate. She wondered what it would be like to live such a life, to never worry about debts or hunger, to have servants instead of being one. The thought brought tears to her eyes, and she quickly blinked them away. This was her life now, and she would make the best of it. 1 year of honest work, and she would have enough money to go wherever she chose. Perhaps she could find work as a governess or a companion to some elderly lady. With her education and refinement, surely she could build a better life somewhere far from Millbrook Valley and its painful reminders of all she had lost. The first weeks at Whitmore Estate passed in a blur of new experiences and aching muscles. Cordelia threw herself into her work with determination that impressed even the most seasoned workers. Under Mrs. Hartwell's patient guidance, she learned to scrub floors until they gleamed, to mend tears in fabric so skillfully that they became invisible, and to prepare meals for the large household with efficiency and care. Her hands, once soft and white, became rough and red from hot water and harsh soap. Her back ached from bending over washtubs and kitchen counters. At night, she fell into bed exhausted, too tired even to think about her former life or uncertain future. But gradually, something unexpected began to happen. The work that had seemed overwhelming at first became routine, then satisfying. There was dignity in honest labor, she discovered, and pride in tasks completed well. The other workers, who had initially seemed so foreign to her experience, revealed themselves to be good people with rich inner lives and generous hearts. Most surprising of all was Silas Whitmore himself. Rather than the distant master she had expected, he moved freely among his workers, joining them for meals when his schedule allowed and asking about their families and concerns. He knew each person by name and seemed to genuinely care about their well-being. Cordelia first noticed his particular attention to her during her 3rd week at the estate. She had been struggling with a heavy bucket of water, trying to carry it to the vegetable garden for Mrs. Hartwell's herb cleaning, when strong hands suddenly relieved her of the burden. "That's too heavy for you," Silas said simply, carrying the bucket as if it weighed nothing. "Tom should have brought this around with the horse cart." "I can manage, sir," Cordelia protested, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "I don't want special treatment." He set the bucket down near the garden and turned to study her with those thoughtful brown eyes. "It's not special treatment, Miss Cordelia. It's common sense. You're half the size of Tom, and that bucket weighs near as much as you do." There was kindness in his voice, but also something else, a gentle concern that made her heart flutter in the most inappropriate way. She reminded herself sternly that he was her employer, a man of wealth and position, while she was merely a servant working off a debt. Such thoughts were not only foolish, but dangerous. "Mrs. Hartwell says you're doing well with the household duties," he continued, apparently unaware of her inner turmoil. "She mentioned you have fine needlework skills." "My mother taught me," Cordelia replied softly. "She said a lady should always keep her hands busy with useful work." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She was." The words came out more wistfully than Cordelia intended, and she saw Silas's expression soften with understanding. "I lost my mother when I was young," he said quietly. "The missing never quite stops, does it?" For a moment they stood in comfortable silence, two people who understood the particular ache of loss. Then Silas cleared his throat and stepped back, as if remembering the proper distance between master and servant. "Well, I should let you get back to your work," he said. "But please, ask Tom or one of the other men to help with the heavy lifting. That's what they're here for." As he walked away, Cordelia found herself watching the confident set of his shoulders, the way he moved with easy grace despite his substantial frame. She had to force herself to look away and focus on her tasks, but the warm feeling his kindness had sparked in her chest lingered throughout the day. The harvest season reached its peak in early October, bringing with it a flurry of activity that seemed to consume every hour of daylight. The entire estate hummed with purpose as workers labored to bring in the year's crops before the first frost could damage them. Cordelia found herself working alongside the other women in the fields, her soft hands finally toughening enough to handle the rough grain stalks without constant pain. It was during one of these long harvest days that disaster struck. Old Henrik, one of the most experienced field workers, collapsed suddenly while loading grain onto a wagon. The other workers carried him to the shade, but it was clear the elderly man was gravely ill. Mrs. Hartwell sent word to the house immediately, and within minutes Silas appeared with the estate's fastest horse, already saddled. "I'm riding to fetch Dr. Morrison," he announced, his usually calm demeanor showing cracks of worry. "Mrs. Hartwell, you know what to do. Everyone else, keep Henrik comfortable and continue the work. We can't afford to lose the daylight." As he swung up into the saddle, his eyes found Cordelia among the gathered workers. "Miss Cordelia, you have gentle hands and a calm manner. Will you help Mrs. Hartwell tend to Henrik?" The trust implicit in his request sent a warm glow through her chest. "Of course, sir." Henrik's condition was serious. His breathing was labored, and his skin had taken on a grey pallor that spoke of heart trouble. Cordelia found herself holding the old man's hand, while Mrs. Hartwell tried to make him comfortable, speaking to him in soft, soothing tones, the way her mother once had when she was ill as a child. "You're going to be fine, Henrik," she murmured. "Dr. Morrison is coming, and Mr. Whitmore will see that you get the best care." Henrik's rheumy eyes focused on her face with effort. "You're a good girl," he whispered. "Different from the others. He sees it too." "Shh, don't try to talk," Cordelia urged, but Henrik weakly squeezed her hand. "He needs someone like you," the old man continued with obvious difficulty. "This place needs a lady's touch again." Before Cordelia could ask what he meant, Dr. Morrison arrived with Silas close behind. The elderly physician examined Henrik thoroughly, while Silas paced nearby, his hands clenched with worry. It was clear that his concern for his workers went far beyond mere economic considerations. These people were like family to him. Dr. Morrison's diagnosis was serious but not hopeless. Henrik had suffered a mild heart episode brought on by overexertion in the heat. With proper rest and care, he would likely recover, though he could no longer perform heavy labor. "I'll have him moved to one of the rooms in the main house," Silas decided immediately. "Mrs. Hartwell can keep a closer eye on him there." "Sir," Cordelia spoke up hesitantly, "if I may, Henrik has worked these fields for most of his life. Being moved away from everything familiar might distress him more. Perhaps if someone could stay with him in his own quarters." Silas looked at her with surprise and growing respect. "You're absolutely right. Would you be willing to take turns sitting with him? I know it's beyond your regular duties." "I'd be honored to help," Cordelia replied without hesitation. Over the following days, as Henrik slowly recovered, Cordelia found herself spending long hours at his bedside. The old man was a storyteller by nature, and as his strength returned, he regaled her with tales of the estate's history. He had been there when Silas's father first bought the land, had watched Silas grow from a boy into the man he was today. His father was a hard man, Henrik confided one evening as Cordelia helped him with his supper. Demanding, quick to anger. Young Silas could have gone the same way, especially after losing his wife so tragically. Cordelia's heart clenched. His wife! Beautiful girl she was. Eleanor Fairfax from the next county. They were wed barely 2 years when the fever took her. Henrik's eyes grew distant with memory. Near broke him, it did. Some men would have turned bitter, but not our Silas. If anything, it made him gentler, more understanding of others' sorrows. That evening, as Cordelia walked back to her quarters, she found herself thinking about the man who had become such an unexpected puzzle. Silas Whitmore was wealthy enough to live a life of leisure, yet he worked alongside his employees. He was young enough and handsome enough to remarry easily, yet he seemed content with his solitary life. Most puzzling of all, he treated her, a mere servant, with a respect and kindness that went far beyond what her position warranted. The October air carried the first hint of winter's chill, and Cordelia pulled her thin shawl more tightly around her shoulders. Soon the harvest would be complete, and the seasonal workers would disperse to other employment. Her own term of service had barely begun, but already she couldn't imagine leaving this place that had become more of a home than she had ever expected. Such thoughts were dangerous, she knew. This was temporary refuge, not a permanent haven. In less than a year, she would have worked off her father's debts and would be free to make her own way in the world. She should be planning for that future, not allowing herself to grow attached to people and places she would have to leave behind. But as she passed the main house, glowing warmly against the darkening sky, she couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to belong somewhere like this. Not as a servant, but as someone with a rightful place in the family that Silas had created among his workers. The thought was so impossible, so far beyond her current circumstances, that she almost laughed at her own foolishness. Yet as she reached her small room, she found herself looking back at the house one more time, and she could have sworn she saw a figure watching from one of the upstairs windows. November brought the first snow, and with it a shift in the estate's rhythm. The outdoor work slowed, but there were still countless tasks to keep everyone busy, repairing equipment, preserving food for winter, and maintaining the buildings that housed both animals and people. Cordelia found herself spending more time in the main house, helping Mrs. Hartwell with deep cleaning and mending. It was during one of these indoor work sessions that she made a discovery that would change everything. Mrs. Hartwell had asked her to organize the books in Silas's study, a task that required careful dusting and rearranging of the volumes that lined the room's tall shelves. As she worked, Cordelia couldn't help but notice the breadth of the collection. Philosophy, agriculture, literature, and history were all represented in what was clearly a well-read library. On the massive oak desk sat a half-finished letter, the ink still fresh enough to suggest Silas had been working on it recently. Cordelia had no intention of prying, but as she dusted around it, a few words caught her eye that made her heart nearly stop. Regarding the matter of Miss Cordelia's father's debts to your establishment. With trembling hands, she set down her dustcloth and looked more carefully at the letter. What she read there made her sink into the chair behind the desk, her mind reeling with shock. Silas was negotiating to pay off the remainder of her father's gambling debts, debts that were far larger than she had ever known. According to the letter, her year of service would cover only a small portion of what was owed. The rest, a sum that represented more money than she could earn in a lifetime, Silas was apparently planning to pay himself. But why? Why would he do such a thing for a servant he barely knew? The sound of approaching footsteps sent her scrambling to return the letter to its original position, but it was too late. Silas appeared in the doorway just as she was standing up from his chair, guilt written clearly across her face. Miss Cordelia. His voice was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. Is everything all right? I'm sorry, sir. I was dusting and I accidentally saw... She gestured helplessly at the desk, unable to finish the sentence. Silas closed the door behind him and moved to stand near the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. How much did you read? He asked finally. Enough to know that my father's debts are far larger than anyone told me, Cordelia whispered, and that you're planning to pay them yourself. He turned to face her, and she was startled by the intensity in his brown eyes. Your father was a good man who made some poor choices. Those choices shouldn't destroy your life. But why? The words burst out of her before she could stop them. Why would you do this for me? I'm nothing to you, just a servant working off a debt. Is that really what you think? Silas took a step closer, and Cordelia's heart began to race. That you're nothing to me? The air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken words and suppressed feelings. Cordelia knew she should look away, should remember her place, but she found herself drowning in the depths of his gaze. I don't know what I am to you, she said honestly. I only know that I'm grateful for your kindness and confused by your generosity. Then let me clear up your confusion. His voice was low and rough with emotion. From the moment you stepped out of that wagon, you've been far more than a servant to me. You've brought something to this house that's been missing since Eleanor died. Grace, gentleness, the kind of quiet strength that makes everyone around you better. Cordelia's breath caught in her throat. Sir, Silas, he corrected gently. My name is Silas. This is impossible, she whispered, though her heart was singing at his words. I'm a servant, a woman with nothing to offer except debts and scandal. I'm a man who's been alone too long, he interrupted, moving closer until only a few feet separated them. A man who's discovered that wealth and position mean nothing without someone to share them with. People will talk. They'll say I'm a fortune hunter, that I seduced you for your money. People will say what they choose to say regardless. The only opinions that matter are ours. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently touched her cheek. Tell me honestly, Cordelia, is there any possibility that you could feel for me what I've come to feel for you? The gentle touch of his hand against her skin sent warmth spreading through her entire body. For weeks, she had tried to deny the growing attraction she felt for this kind, generous man. She had told herself it was gratitude or simple loneliness, or the natural result of his being the only gentleman she encountered in her new life. But standing here in his study, with the firelight casting dancing shadows on the walls, and his brown eyes full of hope and tenderness, she finally admitted the truth to herself. I already do, she whispered. The admission hung between them like a bridge that, once crossed, would change everything forever. Silas's hand trembled slightly against her cheek, and she saw the war of emotions playing across his features, hope, desire, and something that looked remarkably like relief. Cordelia, he murmured her name like a prayer, and then slowly, giving her every opportunity to refuse, he lowered his head until their lips met in the gentlest of kisses. It was nothing like the passionate embraces described in the romantic novels she had read as a girl. Instead, it was tender and reverent, full of promise and unspoken vows. When they finally separated, Cordelia felt as though the world had shifted on its axis, rearranging itself around this new reality, where she was no longer just a servant in his house, but a woman he cared for. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now we take things slowly," Silas replied, though his eyes never left her face. "We give the gossips time to grow bored with other scandals. We let people see that this isn't some temporary infatuation, but something real and lasting. And my debt will be paid regardless of what happens between us. That was never conditional on your feelings, Cordelia. You're free to leave whenever you choose." The generosity of the offer only made her love him more. Here was a man who would give her freedom, even if it meant losing her, who valued her happiness above his own desires. "I don't want to leave," she said firmly. "This place, these people, they've become my family. You've become—" She paused, searching for words adequate to express the depth of her feelings. "What have I become?" he prompted gently. "Everything," she said simply. "You've become everything to me." Winter settled over Whitmore Estate like a soft blanket, bringing with it a slower pace that allowed relationships to deepen and flourish. Silas and Cordelia's courtship unfolded gradually, conducted under the watchful but approving eyes of the estate workers who had come to love them both. There were quiet conversations by the fire in the main house, where Silas would read aloud from his extensive library, while Cordelia worked on her needlework. There were walks through the snow-covered fields, where they talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's thoughts and dreams, with the careful attention of people building a foundation for a lifetime together. The other workers soon guessed the true nature of their relationship, but rather than disapproval, Cordelia found only support and encouragement. Mrs. Hartwell in particular seemed delighted by the development, often finding excuses to send Cordelia to the main house on various errands that inevitably resulted in her spending time with Silas. "It's about time," the housekeeper confided one snowy afternoon as they prepared dinner together. "This house has been too quiet, too empty since Miss Eleanor passed. Mr. Silas needs someone to share his life with, and you need someone who appreciates your gentle heart." "People will say I'm marrying above my station," Cordelia protested, though her heart sang at Mrs. Hartwell's assumption that marriage was inevitable. "People will say many things, but the only opinions that matter are those of the people who truly know you both. And everyone here can see that you belong together." As winter gradually gave way to spring, Silas began including Cordelia more openly in the management of the estate. He valued her opinion on household matters, sought her advice on dealing with worker concerns, and gradually introduced her to the neighbors and local gentry as someone important in his life. The transition wasn't without its challenges. Some of the local ladies, particularly those who had harbored hopes of becoming the second Mrs. Whitmore themselves, were less than welcoming to the former servant who had captured his heart, but Silas's unwavering support and the obvious depth of their affection soon won over all but the most determined critics. The proposal came on a warm evening in late March, as they walked through the estate's garden, where the first spring flowers were beginning to bloom. They had been discussing plans for expanding the workers' quarters when Silas suddenly stopped beside a wooden bench overlooking the fields. "Cordelia," he said, his voice unusually serious, "there's something I want to ask you." She turned to face him, her heart beginning to race as she saw him reach into his coat pocket and withdraw a small velvet box. "I know this might seem rushed to outsiders," he continued, dropping to one knee beside the bench. "We've known each other for barely 6 months, but I also know that I've never felt for anyone what I feel for you. You've brought joy back into my life, purpose beyond just running this estate." With trembling fingers, he opened the box to reveal a ring that took her breath away. It wasn't the largest diamond she had ever seen, but it was perfectly cut and set in a delicate gold band that seemed to capture and reflect every ray of the setting sun. "This was my grandmother's ring," Silas explained. "She was a remarkable woman who married my grandfather for love rather than position, and their marriage was one of the happiest I've ever witnessed. I can't think of anyone I'd rather see wearing it than you." Tears spilled down Cordelia's cheeks as she looked at this man who had given her so much more than freedom from debt. He had given her a home, a family, and a love she had never dared dream possible. "Cordelia Thompson," he said formally, his voice thick with emotion, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, "Yes, of course, yes." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Cordelia marveled at how perfectly it fit, as though it had been waiting for her all along. When Silas rose and pulled her into his arms, spinning her around in a circle, while she laughed with pure joy, she felt as though she were living in a fairy tale. But this was no fairy tale. This was real life, messy and complicated, and more wonderful than any story ever written. The wedding took place 2 months later in the small chapel that served the estate and surrounding farms. Cordelia wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered by Mrs. Hartwell's skilled hands, and carried a bouquet of wildflowers picked from the estate's meadows. She had no family to give her away, but old Henrik, now fully recovered and serving as the estate's stable master, proudly escorted her down the aisle. The chapel was packed with workers from the estate and neighbors from the surrounding farms, all of whom had come to witness the union of two people whose love story had captured the imagination of the entire community. Even some of the local gentry, who had initially disapproved, found themselves moved by the obvious depth of feeling between the bride and groom. As Cordelia walked toward the altar where Silas waited, resplendent in his best black suit, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than a year ago, she had arrived at Whitmore Estate with nothing but debts and despair, forced into service by circumstances beyond her control. Now she was walking toward a future filled with love, purpose, and the kind of happiness she had never thought possible. The scared young woman who had climbed down from that rickety wagon was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more confident, and deeply loved. When she reached the altar, Silas took her hand in his, and she saw in his eyes the same wonder she felt in her own heart. They had found each other against all odds, two lonely souls who had discovered that love could indeed conquer the barriers of class and circumstance. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, but Cordelia barely heard the words. She was lost in Silas's eyes, in the warmth of his hand holding hers, in the knowledge that this was just the beginning of their story together. The vows they spoke were traditional, but the meaning behind them was deeply personal. When Silas promised to love and honor her, she heard his pledge to continue treating her as his equal, regardless of her humble origins. When she promised to support and cherish him, she meant not just as his wife, but as his partner in all the work that made Whitmore Estate more than just a business, a true home for everyone who lived there. As they exchanged rings and were pronounced husband and wife, the chapel erupted in cheers and applause, but Cordelia and Silas heard none of it, lost as they were in their first kiss as a married couple. The celebration that followed was unlike any wedding the community had ever seen. Rather than a formal reception limited to the local elite, Silas and Cordelia hosted a feast for everyone who had played a part in their love story. The estate's great lawn was transformed into an outdoor dining room, with long tables groaning under the weight of food prepared by every cook in the county. There was dancing as the sun set, with Silas leading his new bride in a waltz, while the workers and neighbors looked on with approval and affection. When other couples joined them on the makeshift dance floor, Cordelia felt herself surrounded by community in a way she had never experienced before. Late that evening, as the last guests were making their way home and the estate workers were cleaning up the remnants of the celebration, Silas and Cordelia finally found themselves alone on the porch of what was now truly their home. No regrets? Silas asked softly, pulling her close against his side as they watched the stars emerge in the clear spring sky. Only one, Cordelia replied, then smiled at his look of concern. I regret that it took my father's debts to bring me here. I wish I could have found you some other way. Perhaps, Silas said thoughtfully. But then you might not have stayed long enough for us to discover what we meant to each other. Sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the most difficult circumstances. As they stood together in the quiet darkness, Cordelia reflected on the truth of his words. The forced service that had seemed like the end of her world had actually been the beginning of a life beyond her wildest dreams. She had learned that dignity came not from social position, but from honest work and genuine relationships. She had discovered strength she never knew she possessed, and love that transformed everything it touched. The young woman who had arrived at Whitmore Estate with nothing but debts and despair was gone forever, replaced by someone who knew her own worth and had found her rightful place in the world. She was no longer Cordelia Thompson, the bankrupt gentleman's daughter, or even Cordelia the servant. She was Cordelia Whitmore, wife and partner to the man she loved, mistress of a household that valued kindness above status, and living proof that the most beautiful love stories often begin with the most unlikely circumstances. The estate settled into comfortable quiet around them, and Cordelia knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities. But tonight, wrapped in her husband's arms and surrounded by the home they would build together, she felt nothing but gratitude for the twisting path that had led her to this perfect moment. In the distance, she could see lights still glowing in the workers' quarters, where good people were settling down for the night after celebrating the union of two of their own. These were her people now, her family, and this was her home in every sense that mattered. As Silas led her inside to begin their new life together, Cordelia sent up a silent prayer of thanksgiving for the mysterious ways that Providence works, turning what seems like disaster into the greatest blessing of all. She had come to Whitmore Estate as a servant, but she would remain as its heart, proving that love truly could transform even the most impossible circumstances into the foundation for a lifetime of happiness. And in the years that followed, when travelers would pass through Millbrook Valley and hear the story of the woman who came to serve on the farm and became the cherished wife of its master, they would nod knowingly and say that some tales are too beautiful to be anything but true. For love, when it is real and deep and transformative, has the power to rewrite the rules of society itself, creating new stories from the ashes of old sorrows and proving that the human heart recognizes no boundaries save those it chooses to accept.